They saw a 65-year-old woman, an easy target. But when they cornered a fellow veteran and his K9, they didn't see an old lady. They saw a soldier. An act of bravery that would bring 200 Navy SEALs to her bedside. The cold that settled over the city wasn't just in the biting November air, it was in the bones of the place, in the weary slump of strangers' shoulders. For Eleanor Vance, or Ellie as she insisted, it was a familiar chill. At 65, she'd felt colder. She zipped up the faded olive drab hoodie, the ghost of a 101st Airborne Division Screaming Eagles patch barely visible on the sleeve. Her volunteer shift at the Community Outreach Center had run late, a blur of sorting canned goods and listening to stories from folks who had long run out of people to tell them to. Now, hunger gnawed at her with a dull persistence. She bypassed the trendy, brightly lit chain restaurants, their sterile perfection setting her teeth on edge. Instead, she turned onto a side street, drawn by the humble, flickering neon sign of the North Star Diner. It was a place out of time, a relic of Formica countertops and cracked red vinyl booths that probably hadn't changed since the 70s. The bell above the door chimed a welcome as she pushed inside, the warmth and the rich, comforting scent of brewing coffee and frying onions enveloping her like a hug. She chose a booth by the window, the vinyl cool against her back. Dropping her worn canvas bag, she let out a slow breath, the tension of the day beginning to recede. A waitress with a kind, tired face approached. "Coffee, hon." "Black, please," Ellie said, her voice a little gravelly. "And a grilled cheese with a side of fries." As she waited, her eyes scanned the room. It was a habit forged over decades, a quiet assessment of her surroundings that never truly switched off. Her gaze settled on a man at the counter. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with a back that was slightly bent but still carried the memory of military straightness. His hair was a shock of white, his face a roadmap of deep lines. At his feet, lying with a quiet dignity, was a German Shepherd service dog, its vest faded but the K9 patch still clear. Ellie felt a familiar tug of recognition. It wasn't the man himself, but the archetype. The quiet strength. The way he held his coffee mug with both hands, as if drawing warmth and stability from it. The way his shoulders, though slumped, were still broad. He was a brother in arms. She knew it the way she knew the smell of cordite or the feel of an M16 stock against her shoulder. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to a dusty outpost in the Kunar province, the stoic silence of her own commanding officer as they waited for a medevac that was taking too long. Her coffee arrived, scalding and strong. She took a slow sip, letting the heat seep into her. For a moment, she felt a profound sense of peace. The world outside, with its noise and its haste, fell away. The jingle of the bell above the door shattered the quiet. Two men swaggered in, their laughter loud and abrasive, bouncing off the tiled floor. They were young, reeking of cheap cologne and entitlement, their eyes sweeping the diner with a predatory arrogance. Ellie clocked them instantly, the way they moved with too much confidence, their casual disregard for everyone else's space. She felt a low thrum of warning in her gut. She'd seen boys like this before, in bars near military bases, looking for trouble they were ill-equipped to handle. They slid into the booth directly behind the veteran, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "Check out the old-timer," one of them snickered, his voice carrying easily in the quiet diner. "Think he remembers what war he was in?" His friend let out a wet snort of laughter. "Look at him, trying to look tough with that flea-bitten mutt. Dog's probably as ancient as he is." Ellie's hand tightened around her mug. She could see the old veteran's shoulders stiffen. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them, but the line of his jaw hardened. The K9 at his feet let out a low, almost imperceptible whine, pressing its body closer to his leg. "Hey, Pops," the first one called out, louder this time. "Does that thing even bite, or does it just lay there and fart dust all day?" The other patrons in the diner shifted uncomfortably. A few shot nervous glances, then quickly looked back down at their plates. No one said a word. They were civilians. They didn't understand the lines being crossed. Insulting a man was one thing. Insulting his K9, a partner, a lifesaver, a fellow soldier with 4 legs, was a declaration of war. Ellie had had enough. She set her mug down with a soft but deliberate click. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She pitched it to the command frequency she hadn't used in years, the one that cut through chaos and demanded attention. Leave him alone. The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. All conversation ceased. The 2 men turned, their smirks faltering into confusion. The one who had been talking squinted at her. "What did you say, Grandma?" Ellie met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, were as hard as chipped granite. "You heard me," she said, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. "Stand down. You're done here." The man's friend cracked his knuckles, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "This ain't your business, lady." "It is now," Ellie stated. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. A tense moment stretched. The man who had spoken first seemed to weigh his options. He saw a 65-year-old woman in a faded hoodie. He didn't see the combat medic who had held boys younger than him together with pressure dressings and prayer. He didn't see the soldier. He finally slammed a hand on his table, rattling the salt shaker. "Whatever," he muttered, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. "This place sucks anyway. Let's bounce." They stood up and started for the door. But the first one paused as he passed Ellie's booth. He leaned down, his face unpleasantly close, his breath sour. "You're gonna regret that, you old bitch," he whispered, his eyes flat and cold. Ellie didn't break eye contact. She didn't even blink. She just held his gaze until he straightened up, unnerved, and followed his friend out the door. The bell chimed sharply, and they were gone. The diner exhaled. The veteran at the counter slowly turned on his stool. His eyes, watery and tired, found hers. They held a mixture of profound gratitude and shame. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. Ellie gave him a short, sharp nod. "He's a good-looking dog," she said, her gaze flicking to the shepherd. "What's his name?" "Gunner," the man replied, a faint pride in his voice. He was with the 75th Ranger Regiment. "Airborne," Ellie said simply, tapping her own faded patch. "Stay safe out there, soldier." She finished her coffee, paid her bill, and headed back into the cold night, the man's parting words echoing in her mind. She didn't believe in regrets, but she did believe in threats. The warmth of the diner vanished the instant Ellie stepped back outside, replaced by a raw, damp cold that bit at her cheeks. The street was darker now, the sparse streetlights casting long, distorted shadows that clung to the brickwork of the buildings. She pulled her hoodie tighter, her breath pluming in the air. A moment later, the diner door opened again, and Mr. Henderson emerged, his K9, Gunner, staying so close he was practically attached to the man's leg. "Heading this way?" Ellie asked, her tone casual, nodding down the street. He nodded, looking uneasy. "Just to the bus stop at the corner." "Mind if I walk with you?" It wasn't a question. Her internal threat assessment was blaring. The 2 men from the diner had been too arrogant to just walk away. An insult to their pride like the one she delivered often required a foolish, violent answer. Her training screamed that an open street was better than a blind corner, and 2 sets of eyes were better than one. "I'd appreciate that," Henderson said, relief softening the tension in his face. They started walking, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Gunner moved with them, his head on a swivel, ears twitching at every distant sound. The dog knew. He was on patrol. They made it 20 paces from the diner's entrance when Ellie saw them. 2 silhouettes detaching themselves from the deeper darkness of an alleyway up ahead. They were leaning against the wall, trying to look casual, but their stillness was predatory. Ellie stopped. Her entire body went on high alert, a cold, familiar calm settling over her. Adrenaline began its slow, steady drip into her veins. Henderson stopped beside her, his breath catching in his throat as he saw them too. Fear, stark and immediate, bloomed on his face. The two men straightened up, blocking the sidewalk. "Well, well," the first one sneered, his voice carrying a false bravado. "Look who it is. Grandma and Grandpa out for a little stroll." Ellie shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, placing herself slightly in front of Henderson. It was an old instinct, shielding the one she was tasked to protect. "Just go," she said, her voice low and steady. "Walk away. This doesn't have to go any further." "Oh, I think it does," the second one chuckled, stepping forward. "You had a real big mouth in there, old lady. Time to see if you can back it up." "Don't," Ellie warned, her eyes darting between the two, assessing their stance, their hands, their distance. They were close. Too close. They weren't listening. The first man reached into his jacket pocket. For a sickening instant, a flicker of metal caught the orange glow of a streetlight. A blade. Ellie didn't have time to think. She acted. "Get back. Go," she barked at Henderson, pushing him forcefully behind her. The command was sharp, honed by years of battlefield urgency. But it was too late. The man with the knife lunged. Ellie sidestepped, her body moving with a surprising agility, a ghost of the combat drill she'd practiced 1,000 times. She brought her heavy canvas bag around in a wide arc, aiming for his head. The bag, weighted with a book and a metal water bottle, connected with a satisfying thud, staggering him. But the second attacker was already on her. He grabbed her from the side, his thick arms pinning hers. The first man recovered, his face contorted in rage. He lunged again. Ellie twisted violently, trying to break free, but the hold was too strong. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in her side. She gasped as the blade slid in, a sickening, violating pressure. He pulled it out and stabbed again. And again. A raw, ragged scream tore from her throat as she felt the third puncture, deeper this time. Gunner exploded into action. The K9, a fury of black fur and bared teeth, launched himself at the knife-wielding attacker, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The man howled in pain and surprise, trying to shake the dog off. The distraction gave Ellie a split second. She stomped down hard on the instep of the man holding her. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench one arm free. She drove her elbow back into his ribs with all her strength. Henderson was shouting, his voice frail and panicked. The man with the knife finally managed to dislodge Gunner by kicking him hard in the ribs. The dog yelped and fell back, but immediately scrambled to his feet, barking wildly. Another stab. This one drove the air from Ellie's lungs and buckled her knees. The world tilted, the streetlights blurring into streaks. She hit the cold, gritty pavement with a bone-jarring impact. She could feel the warm, sticky wetness spreading across her abdomen, soaking her hoodie. Her vision was tunneling to a pinpoint. She could hear Henderson screaming her name. Gunner's frantic barking sounded far away. Headlights suddenly swung around the corner, painting the scene in a harsh, unforgiving light. The attackers froze like startled animals, then turned and fled into the darkness of the alley. Tires screeched. A car door flew open. Someone was yelling, "Oh my God! Call 911. Hands were on her, pressing down on her side. A woman's voice, tight with panic, was saying, "Stay with me. Stay with me. Help is coming." Ellie tried to speak, to ask if Henderson and Gunner were safe, but a coppery taste filled her mouth. Blood. Her mission, she hadn't finished it. The thought echoed in the fading recesses of her mind as the darkness rushed in to claim her completely. The bay doors of St. Michael's Hospital's emergency department flew open with a crash, and chaos flooded in. On the gurney, Ellie was a study in grim contrasts, the ghostly pale of her skin against the dark, spreading crimson that saturated the makeshift bandages and her old hoodie. Her face was clammy, her breathing shallow and ragged. Female, 65, multiple penetrating trauma to the abdomen and flank. 5 wounds visible. BP is 80/40 and dropping, a paramedic shouted, jogging alongside the gurney as they navigated the crowded hallway. A trauma team converged, a whirlwind of blue and green scrubs. The overhead fluorescent lights were harsh, slicing through the tense air. An experienced charge nurse, Maria, took one look at Ellie and started barking orders. Trauma 1, now. Get me 2 large-bore IVs, ONEG on the infuser, and page Dr. Chen, stat. They swarmed her in the trauma bay. Her clothes were cut away with rough efficiency by a young resident, revealing the ugly, gaping gashes that pulsed weakly with every faint heartbeat. Nurses jammed lines into the veins of her arms. An oxygen mask was forced over her mouth and nose. We're losing her, a nurse called out as the monitor above Ellie's head began to blare a frantic, high-pitched alarm. Dr. Chen, the trauma surgeon, swept in, already gloved and gowned. He was a man who operated with a calm, focused intensity that belied the life and death stakes. What do we have? At least 5 stabs, looks like a single-edged blade. Major hemorrhaging, Maria reported, hanging a bag of blood. Get me a scope in there. I need to see the damage. Suction. Chen commanded. Ellie heard none of it. She was adrift in a vast, silent void, a place beyond pain and fear. Outside, Mr. Henderson had been stopped by hospital security at the ER entrance. He pressed his face against the glass, his hands splayed wide, his eyes wild with terror and guilt. He kept repeating her name, his voice a hoarse whisper. Gunnar sat loyally at his feet, refusing to move, letting out a low, mournful whine that cut through the sterile hum of the hospital. He knew his pack was incomplete. He knew one of his own was hurt. Inside, the news was spreading. A nurse recognized the faded 101st Airborne hoodie as they bagged it for evidence. She's a vet, he murmured to Maria. Maria paused, her gaze flicking from the monitor to Ellie's face, a new layer of understanding dawning. As they cleaned her for surgery, they found them, old scars, silvery and white against her skin. A long, straight line on her thigh from an old shrapnel wound. A puckered circle on her shoulder. This wasn't the first time this woman's body had been a battlefield. In the operating room, the fight intensified. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. Dr. Chen worked with furious precision, his commands sharp and clear. Clamp. More suction here, I can't see the bleeder. Damn it, the liver is clipped. BP is dropping again. Hanging another unit of blood. She's going into shock. Give me 2 amps of AP, now. The surgical team, a mix of seasoned veterans and young residents, moved in a practiced, desperate dance. They were fighting a war against time, against the relentless tide of blood loss. Every vessel they tied off was a small victory, but another would present itself. The monitor beeped a frantic, uneven rhythm, a constant reminder of how thin the line between life and death had become. Hours crawled by. Outside the OR, a small vigil had formed. Maria, her shift long over, sat against the wall, her face tight with a worry that went beyond professional duty. A few other nurses and orderlies who knew of the old soldier in Trauma 1 lingered, speaking in hushed tones. Mr. Henderson had been led to a small family waiting room, where he paced relentlessly, Gunnar trotting anxiously at his heels. He couldn't sit. He couldn't speak. He just paced, his mind replaying the attack in a sickening loop. He'd made one phone call, his voice cracking, to a number he hadn't dialed in years, a friend from his old unit, a man who knew how to get the word out. Back in the OR, Dr. Chen finally took a step back, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. Okay, he said, his voice raspy. We've packed the worst of it. The bleeding is controlled, for now. She's not out of the woods, not by a long shot. Let's get her to the ICU. As they wheeled her out, she was a pale figure lost in a tangle of tubes and wires, a ventilator breathing for her with a soft, rhythmic hiss. The team that had fought for her watched in silence. They had done their part. Now, it was up to her. In the ICU, a new team took over, connecting her to a new bank of monitors. Her heartbeat was there, a thin, uncertain thread, but it was there. A young ICU nurse, checking the drip, looked at her sleeping face, at the lines of age and hardship etched there. "God, I hope she makes it," she whispered to her colleague. Outside, in the sterile quiet of the hallway, Mr. Henderson had finally slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. Gunnar lay at his feet, exhausted but vigilant. They weren't going anywhere. They were holding the line. The first headlights appeared on the hospital access road just before 0400 hours, cutting lonely beams through the pre-dawn mist. A security guard named Dave, nursing a lukewarm coffee near the main entrance, watched them with mild curiosity. It wasn't the usual single car of a worried family member. It was a slow, deliberate procession. Dark SUVs, battered pickup trucks, a few heavy-duty motorcycles that rumbled to a stop before their engines were cut with an almost reverent silence. By the time the horizon began to bleed with the first pale light of dawn, the parking lot was filling up. Men, and a few women, emerged from the vehicles. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose. Some were young, active duty, with the ramrod posture and short-cropped hair of their trade, trident pins gleaming faintly on their uniforms. Others were older, gray at the temples, wearing worn leather jackets with faded unit patches, the easy, settled weight of experience in their stance. Every single one of them was a Navy SEAL, past or present. The word had spread overnight, moving with the speed and efficiency of a battlefield command. It had gone from Henderson's desperate call to a retired Master Chief, then rippled through encrypted chats, text chains, and hushed phone calls across the country. The message was simple and stark: an Army medic, sister in arms, went down protecting one of ours. St. Michael's Hospital. Show up. No one told them to come. There was no official order. They just did. Some had driven all night, fueled by coffee and a cold, quiet rage. Some had called out of work, offering no explanation. They had come from San Diego, from Virginia Beach, from quiet suburban homes where they were husbands and fathers. Tonight, they were something else. They were a tribe, gathering to honor one of their own. Inside, the night staff stared out the windows in disbelief. "Who the hell are they?" an intern asked, peering through the blinds. Maria, who had stayed long past her shift, came to look. She saw the lines of silent men, standing at a relaxed parade rest, hands clasped behind their backs or arms folded. No talking. No smoking. Just waiting. A shiver went down her spine. "They're soldiers," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. By 0600, there were nearly 200 of them. They didn't crowd the entrance. They filled the parking lot and the manicured lawns, a silent, disciplined army taking up position. In the ICU waiting area, Henderson lifted his head as a nurse gently touched his arm. "Mr. Henderson," she said softly. "They're here." "Who?" he asked, his voice raw. She just nodded toward the glass doors at the end of the hall. He squinted, and his breath caught. Even from here, he could see them. Rows of them. Standing vigil. His mouth went dry. He tightened his grip on Gunnar's harness, his knuckles white. "They're here for her," he croaked, tears welling in his eyes and spilling down his weathered cheeks. A grizzled Master Chief with a face like a topographical map walked into the lobby. He approached the main desk, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. "We're here for Eleanor Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What's her status?" Maria stepped forward. "She's out of surgery. She's in the ICU, stable but critical. It's touch and go." The Master Chief gave a single, decisive nod. "Then we'll wait." He turned and walked back outside, and the silent watch continued. They took up space in the hallways and the lobby, leaning against walls or sitting in chairs brought from conference rooms. They were quiet, respectful, but their presence was overwhelming. It wasn't threatening, it was profoundly protective. It was a shield, forged of shared sacrifice, being raised around the woman in ICU bed 4. Gunnar sensed the shift. The dog, who had been whining anxiously for hours, let out a soft whimper, and his tail gave a single, tentative thump against the linoleum. He could smell it in the air, the scent of brothers, of his pack. Henderson bent over and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, pressing his forehead into the thick fur. "Look at them, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking. They came. The hospital had never seen anything like it. In the pediatrics ward, a little boy with a broken arm pressed his nose to the window. "Mommy, who are those army men?" "They're here because someone was very, very brave," his mother answered, her own eyes misty. The SEALs refused to leave. When the ICU doors swung open, they would all look up as one, their eyes searching for a sign. They were waiting for news of the old soldier they had never met, but for whom they had sworn a silent, unbreakable oath. They were on watch. And they wouldn't stand down until their sister-in-arms did. A twitch. A flicker of an eyelid. Consciousness returned to Ellie not as a wave, but as a slow, painful tide rising through a fog of morphine. The first thing she registered was pain, a deep, searing fire in her abdomen that pulsed in time with the rhythmic beep of a machine somewhere to her left. She tried to take a deep breath and gasped, the effort sending a fresh agony through her torso. Her vision swam, then slowly sharpened to the stark reality of a hospital room ceiling. Bleached white tiles. The clinical smell of antiseptic. And 4 lines snaked from her arm, connected to a bag of clear fluid. She tried to lift her hand, but it felt impossibly heavy, a leaden weight she couldn't command. It twitched feebly against the thin hospital blanket. Instantly, a hand covered hers. It was warm, calloused, and held hers with a gentle but unshakable strength. Her blurry gaze followed the arm up to a face she recognized. Mr. Henderson. His eyes were raw and red-rimmed, his gray hair matted from days without sleep. He was hunched forward in a stiff visitor's chair, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. "Ellie," he croaked, his voice cracking. He bent his head, pressing his forehead to their joined hands. "Thank God. Oh, thank God." At the sound of his voice, Gunnar, who had been lying at his feet, lifted his great shaggy head, his tail thumping softly against the floor. He let out a low, happy whine. Ellie's lips were cracked and dry. She tried to speak, but only a faint, airy rasp came out. Her eyes darted around the room, frantic for understanding. Flashes of the attack returned, the cold air, the glint of the blade, Gunnar's ferocious barking. The blood. Then she saw the movement outside the window. She blinked hard, forcing her eyes to focus through the haze of pain and medication. The sun was rising, casting a warm, golden light across the hospital lawn. And on that lawn, stood rows and rows of men. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Some in uniform, some in civilian clothes. They stood stock still, shoulder to shoulder, a silent, disciplined formation. They weren't talking. They were just there. Watching. Waiting. Her heart rate spiked. The monitor beside her bed let out a soft, insistent alarm. A nurse hurried in and silenced it with a button press, her eyes kind. "Easy there, Eleanor. You're safe." The nurse followed Ellie's gaze to the window and smiled, her own eyes shining. "They've been here all night," she murmured. "They haven't left. Not for a second." Ellie's eyes burned with tears she was too weak to shed. Her gaze swung back to Henderson. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "They heard what you did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That dog you saved. Gunnar, he served with their brothers. He's one of theirs. And that makes you one of theirs, too. A sob clawed its way up Ellie's throat, but it hurt too much to let it out. Instead, a single, hot tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a path into her hairline. She looked back at the window, at the stoic, sunlit faces of the men standing guard. In her mind, a single, powerful word formed. A word from a life she thought was long behind her. Muster. It was an honor guard. A silent, living tribute. She felt something inside her crack. It wasn't a rib this time, but the icy wall she'd built around her heart over years of quiet, solitary survival. It shattered under the sheer, crushing weight of a gratitude so fierce it stole her breath. The nurse gently adjusted her pillow. One of them asked me to give you this, when you were awake. She held up a heavy, bronze coin. It was thick and ornate, with the unmistakable eagle, anchor, and trident of the Navy SEALs embossed on its surface. A challenge coin. The nurse carefully placed it on the bedside table, next to a glass of water. He said to tell you. Welcome home, soldier. That was it. The tears came then, hot and silent, spilling freely down her temples. Her eyes locked on Henderson's, and though she couldn't speak, her expression said everything. I'd do it again. He nodded, his own tears falling onto their joined hands. He understood. I know, he whispered. I know you would. Ellie closed her eyes, exhausted beyond measure, but her hands stayed curled tight around the old veterans. Outside, the SEALs held their ground, a silent, unmovable promise under the rising sun. She wasn't alone. She was home. Recovery was a war of attrition fought in inches. The first time Ellie sat up, the world spun and a knife of pure agony twisted in her side, forcing a choked gasp from her lips. The first time she tried to stand, her legs trembled and threatened to buckle. Every breath was a negotiation with pain. But Ellie Vance was no stranger to difficult battles. She approached physical therapy with the same grim determination she'd once used to ruck march through unforgiving mountains. Her hospital room became a command center of goodwill. Flowers and cards arrived from strangers across the country who had heard her story. The hospital staff treated her with a gentle reverence. And she was never, ever alone. Mr. Henderson and Gunnar were near daily visitors. Henderson would sit and read the newspaper to her, his quiet presence a comforting anchor. Gunnar would rest his heavy head on her lap, a warm, living weight of gratitude. The SEALs, true to their word, did not disappear. They organized themselves into informal shifts. One day it would be a young, quiet SEAL who would talk about his kid's soccer practice. The next, it would be a retired Master Chief who would share stories of the bold Navy. They called her Ellie or Ma'am, but in their eyes, she saw a deeper title, Sister. They brought her books, terrible coffee they complained about alongside her, and a sense of belonging so powerful it healed wounds deeper than any blade could reach. Then came the bills. Piles of them. Even with Medicare, the cost of trauma surgery, an extended ICU stay, and reconstructive procedures was astronomical. Ellie stared at a statement for $250,000 one afternoon, a cold dread seeping into her that no amount of morphine could dull. 2 days later, the hospital administrator knocked on her door, a thick envelope in his hand. This is for you, Ms. Vance. Inside was a certified check. The amount made her dizzy, $350,000. The note attached was written in a strong, clear hand. From your brothers and sisters. For your medical bills and anything else you need. Your watch is over. Let us take it from here. The fundraising had been started by Henderson's old unit and amplified by the SEAL community. Donations had poured in from VFW posts, American Legion halls, and ordinary citizens from all 50 states. Ellie held the check in her trembling hand and wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming shock of being so thoroughly cared for. When she was finally discharged, frail but walking, she found her small, modest home transformed. A team of veterans from a local outreach group had fixed her leaky roof, painted her porch, and built a wheelchair ramp she thankfully wouldn't need for long. A month later, she was invited to a meeting at the local Veterans Hall. The air inside smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and honor. The room went quiet when she entered. The man who stood to greet her was the gray-haired SEAL Master Chief who had organized the vigil. "Ellie," he began, his voice rumbling through the quiet room. "What you did, it reminded a lot of us what this is all about. It's not about the uniform or the war. It's about what comes after. It's about showing up." He paused, clearing his throat. "This community has a lot of guys who are falling through the cracks. Good soldiers who came home from the fight, only to find another one waiting for them here. They don't trust hospitals. They don't ask for help. But they might trust one of their own." He looked her square in the eye. "We've used the momentum from your story to establish a new fund. A new initiative. We're calling it the Vance Vanguard. An emergency aid network for local veterans. We need someone to lead it. Someone with medical knowledge. Someone with grit. Someone they'll listen to." Ellie blinked, her heart pounding. I'm just a retired medic," she whispered. "Exactly," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "You're a soldier. And we have a new mission for you." She took the job. Slowly, she built a new life. She organized mobile health clinics, dragging old vets out of their lonely apartments for blood pressure checks. She taught CPR and first aid classes. She helped connect veterans struggling with PTSD to counselors who understood their language. She had been good in the hospital. Here, she was essential. Her scars remained, a permanent, puckered map across her torso. She never hid them. Months later, standing before a packed room at a fundraiser, she looked out at the faces of men and women who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to do good. Her voice, once shaky, was now strong. She told her story, and at the end, she held up the SEAL Challenge coin that never left her pocket. "That night," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "I was reminded that our oath doesn't expire when we take off the uniform. Our watch never truly ends." She looked down at her own scars, then back at the crowd. "Some wounds heal. Others, we carry. But we never have to carry them alone." If Eleanor's incredible story of courage, loyalty, and community moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing for more stories that matter. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and read your thoughts. As always, this is a community built on respect. Please, comment with respect, especially for those who have served and the families who support them. Thank you for watching.